Last night, Cyril Ramaphosa delivered his State of the Nation speech. Lots of focus on the electricity crisis, including announcing a state of disaster. Connie Mulder doesn't like it. His team at Solidarity Research Institute are very unhappy, and they're actually going to court on it. We'll find out what a state of disaster means, why they're going to court, why it's all so important, and actually how we're going to get this electricity issue sorted. Connie, good to see you. We've always had very rational conversations. This one, though, I guess I'm coming from a position of saying, do you have to go to court? Can't we just get this damn thing sorted out?
Alec, I wish we didn't have to. Unfortunately, there are no options left. We were quite shocked actually to hear that they did declare a state of disaster, because in the same speech, President Ramaphosa announces, I don't know if you watched it, he says, yes, all of these ministries already exist and all of these tools already exist, but they're not coordinated centrally. So therefore, he needs a state of disaster to do that. Now, that is hogwash. He's a president. He's the central coordination. He doesn't need a state of disaster to do any of this. And I think our worry stems from the simple fact, a state of disaster gives government immense power. We saw that with COVID. It gives them truly immense power to do something that can already be done in existing legislation. And that is the frustration, is if you've got useless ministers, which is exactly what we've got. We've got Minister Mantashe, who's been completely incompetent and useless in handling the energy crisis. The way out of that is to fire the useless minister, not to declare a state of disaster, appoint another minister who now needs to once again try and solve this. And that's why we're extremely worried. The analogy that we use is to say that what the state of disaster powers for government would mean is, if you've got an incompetent builder and you continue giving them bigger hammers, you're not going to get a better building at the end. You're just going to get more damage to the existing structure. And that is what a state of disaster entails. It gets rid of a lot of the oversight, which we shouldn't have. It doesn't expedite things truly in the power situation that much, if at all. And it once again opens the door for abuses of power that we've seen and we've had much too much of in this state of disaster legislative form.
When should a state of disaster be used? You've now already given us some background into it. It appears as though it should be used very cautiously, very rarely. Is there any time in your mind when it would be applicable?
No, absolutely. So a state of disaster is meant for an actual disaster, meaning a flood hits us, an earthquake, something that, and the law is quite explicit on this, something that does not have existing legislative measures in place to handle it. So with the COVID pandemic, for example, you have a Department of Health, that's true, but we do not have the capacity to handle a pandemic that hits the country. And that's not part of the Department of Health's mandate in any case, is that they should do general health care. So a state of disaster made sense, at least in the first month, while we're figuring things out in that case. The floods in Natal is another thing where that's a state of disaster. You need access to quickly respond to that. A 16-year-long train crash that we've seen coming all the way, with a whole ministry already devoted to it, does not guarantee this. In fact, if we're talking about emergency procurement of powers, Minister Mantashe can do that. He can do it tomorrow, let's say the day after tomorrow. He first needs to consult with NERSA and confirm that there is indeed a power shortage. That should be a very short conversation. I cannot imagine that being that difficult. And then he can gazette an emergency procurement, which he's done. On this July 2020, he did exactly that, saying we need emergency power, and stop procuring the emergency power. Give tenders out, do what you must. So everything that the president announced, even the tax incentive for solar panels, getting a wholesale market, all of that can be done within existing legislation. There is no reason other than political theatre to now announce a state of disaster. From our perspective, he's giving himself massive amounts of power once again, with no real upside to this. There's no reason, there's no actual natural disaster that we're not prepared for. This would be akin, a minister not doing his job is bad, but it's not a disaster. It's something that can be fixed by simply firing Minister Mantashe. This would be akin to saying we've got lots of potholes in our roads, trucks are hitting them, cars are hitting them with our accidents. We're going to declare a state of disaster on our roads, and then we're going to do, instead of just fixing the Ministry of Transport and getting them to do their job. And that is where our worry lies. Is the previous time we did a state of disaster, we need to remember President Ramaphosa was an eloquent statesman in announcing it, and everyone was sort of optimistic. And then we figured out that the guys who are implementing this are not going to be President Ramaphosa. It's going to be NDZ, from what we can see, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, and Minister Montash and Gordon will be involved at some point. So that's the guys who are going to get this power, and we're going to now implement solutions that haven't worked in the past 16 years. Minister Montash is extremely hard up for getting either open cycle gas turbines running or just fixing the coal plants, as if that's something that can magically happen in a state of disaster. And we're going to move away from getting energy on the grid quickly. Everything he wants to do, he can already do. The existing legislation is there. If you're not using the instruments correctly, having more instruments is not going to fix that.
What about the possibility that things are a heck of a lot worse than what we know, i.e. that we could really be on the brink of a serious disaster, and that perhaps the president knows more than we know, and as a consequence, he needs those powers. Otherwise, if the grid collapses, well, then we really do go back into the dark ages.
Well, if the grid collapses, there will obviously be emergency services necessary. However, every single expert that we've talked to, every single expert, in fact, the CEO of Eskom, the operational head of Eskom, has stated explicitly on the record, the grid collapsing is not a possibility at the moment. It's very far off, and then a lot of things need to go wrong. So I don't know who they're consulting, but a total blackout is something that Eskom itself, as well as several energy experts, just discount as that's not going to happen. Jan Oberholzer was, I remember him saying, we'll shut off whole provinces before we have a total blackout, which means it's not a realistic situation or scenario. It's obviously there's a possibility, but it's very small. You cannot declare a state of disaster proactively. It means it's by definition a reactive piece of legislation. So that means we can't, for example, say we think a meteor might hit South Africa at some point in the future. Now we're declaring a state of disaster to handle whatever happens if the meteor happens. It's a disaster needs to happen for this legislation to be declared. The reason this is so important, because government gets truly immense executive power. Suddenly, Parliament does not have oversight over them anymore. Government can just gazette new regulations that immediately come into effect with full legislative and executive powers, meaning the police can arrest you if you do not do something like this. You can be prosecuted, you can go to jail, as we saw with COVID. And there is very little that you can do to stop these regulations other than taking them to court. That's how Minister Patel managed the extreme decision of saying warm chicken is a danger to society. He banned it, and it took several court challenges to actually get that overturned. But that warm chicken was still banned for almost a month. And now this is the situation that we're going into again. And the people who made the decisions during COVID, these guys who made all of these excellent decisions, are now going to be making the decisions with very little oversight if the state of disaster continues on the energy crisis. So what frustrates us is that several of the recommendations that President Ramaphosa made in July last year are good. They're good ideas. They should be able to work. A tax incentive for solar panels will most definitely be something that we welcome. Creating a wholesale market for electricity so that we can start trading it as a commodity is something that South Africa has to do. We need to go that direction. But he's looking at the chariot and making it a much better chariot and not seeing that all the horses are dead. And that means it doesn't help that we're continuing to get all of these good ideas and making it the most beautiful chariot in the world. But we've got Minister Montash and Minister Gordon trying to pull it, and they're truly, it's dead horses that it doesn't help you flog them anymore. In fact, we've now added a third minister. The confusion that's going to stem from that is massive, and that leaves us with no option other than to say, we don't think it's rational, as we think you've got all the legislative instruments that you need to do this. In fact, we're of the opinion the reason we're here is because government has been trying to solve this problem for 16 years. It has not managed. More government is not going to solve this problem. Government got us into this. What needs to be done is to simply step aside and allow a normal market to take place here with private and the community sector starting to generate power, starting to sell power. What can be done, however, as President Ramaphosa can tell NERSA, publish these guidelines that you should have published regarding wheeling and feed-in tariffs, just so that investors can get some security as to what will it cost me to transfer electricity on the existing infrastructure. That automatically opens the market for massive private sector investment. Going in the state of disaster way means more government interference, more central planning. None of that will solve this problem.
So if I understand you correctly, the state of disaster is really optics. Everything is there, but it's optics which also brings with it a heck of a lot of power that might be abused, because we know that the people who did it last time round wanted open shoes and arresting people on the beaches and so on. So we get that. What about realpolitik, though, because here you've got Ramaphosa. We know the ANC, according to Professor William Gumede, who spoke to my colleague Linda van Tilburg in the past week, is funded to a large degree by the coal lobby. The coal lobby who really don't want to give quality coal to Eskom. They're quite happy to put a few rocks in there to get the numbers up. That is Mantashe's constituency. On the other hand, within Eskom, the constituency there is the Labour, who we know that it's massively overstaffed. So there's lots that needs to be done. If Ramaphosa, as the president, knows he's not going to get support from Mantashe, who supposedly has oversight, he's not going to get the privatization from a communist in Pravin Gordhan, so maybe bring in somebody else who is going to be able to push it all through. Might it not just be the new Minister of Electricity, some realpolitik at work here?
Undoubtedly, it's part of that. But the thing is, Alec, you and I saying we don't think this minister will get the job done is one thing. The president saying that is actually it's a motion of no confidence in his own cabinet that he announced last night. But he has the power to fire these people. So the question should be, why is Minister Mantashe in your cabinet if he's not doing his job? Why aren't you replacing him? The way to get around internal ANC politics is not to plunge the country into a state of disaster. It's to get rid of non-performing ministers. If you want to shuffle into another portfolio, any of that would have worked as well. Our worry is exactly that. Is Minister Mantashe is heavily invested in the coal industry, from what we can see, or the coal lobby. And if he comes, the idea that he's not going to try and sabotage or obstruct the new minister is something that we find, quite frankly, laughable. It's not clearly defined what this minister will be in charge of. And Mr. Gordhan is still there. He's still going to be the shareholder responsible for Eskom, or the person handling it as the shareholder. Minister Mantashe is most likely still going to be at Energy. He's the one responsible for planning what capacity and what technology we use and gets added. So this new Minister of Electricity will not be able to do anything else if the president himself can't overrule these ministers. A new minister in the presidency is not going to do that. A state of disaster is not going to do that. You need to either get rid of the dead wood, or we're not going to succeed. And for the ANC electorally, or just in general surviving, their funds might come from the coal lobby, but their votes come from the public, and there's nothing that hits them as hard electorally as load shedding. And that means, as a president, you rarely get the opportunity where you need to choose between good and bad. Most of the time, the choices are between bad and worst. And unfortunately, we chose the worst option. The bad option would have been to get renewable energy online, open the market, privatize. You would have taken some hits inside your party, that's true. But the country would have been at a much lower level of load shedding, even almost out of it, when the election rolls around next year. So it just doesn't make any sense, even from a political point of view. This has been the wrong choice. It's once again Ramaphosa choosing ANC unity over literally the country's economic future. And that says, from our perspective, there's no chance that these guys are going to solve it. In the same speech, and that is what it's almost poetic karma. It's in the same speech where he announces, we're going to declare a state of disaster to deal with an emergency in electricity. Later in the speech, he declares, we're going to privatize the SAPS's 10111 number because it's not being answered by the state. So that is an actual emergency, and the state can't handle that small level of emergency capacity. Yet for some reason, they're going to be able to successfully now, for the fifth or sixth time, solve load shedding in 12 to 18 months. Ramaphosa announced in 2014, load shedding will be a thing of the past in 12 to 18 months. He once again announced it. We're of the opinion, stop listening to his speech and start listening to his history. It's not going to happen this way. We need to stop this. We need to get the private sector involved, and we need to get rid of the obstructing ministers, or at least move them to other portfolios where they can't do that anymore.
I know you guys come from a trade union background, and I know that executives in the well-paid executives are not really your constituency. But with Andre de Ruyter, from all accounts, he's done a fantastic job under incredibly difficult circumstances. Would that not also have been a drum that you could have beat, not to allow him to leave the scene? He certainly seems to be at least one adult in the kindergarten that's running the place at the moment.
Unfortunately, I think that ship has sailed. Mr. de Ruyter resigned, and I fully understand that, after Minister Mantashe accused him of basically planning a coup, saying that Eskom is trying to overthrow the government. At the Nasri conference, Eskom is trying to overthrow the government with sabotaging power stations. Now, a minister saying we don't think this guy's doing his job is one thing, and that can sort of pass in silence. But a minister stating that a head of an SOE is trying to overthrow the government with absolute deafening silence from Minister Gordhan and President Ramaphosa in his defense leaves him no option. That means you've clearly lost confidence in me, and I'm not going to do this job if you're accusing me of sabotage and overthrowing it. It just doesn't make any sense, and it means he's lost all political backing, which makes the ESCOM job quite frankly impossible. We obviously would like Mr. Director and especially Mr. Oberholzer to stay on as long as possible. And for the first time in almost 10 years, we've actually had visibility and transparency as to what is going on at ESCOM. Previously, the lights would just go on and people would tell you, don't worry, it rained. The coal is wet. As if it hasn't rained in South Africa the past 60, 70 years. So obviously something else is going on. But I think Mr. Director is gone. I don't think he's going to come back. That ship has sailed. President Ramaphosa missed that boat. He rather chose to not chastise Minister Montage, which truly deserved a proper scrubbing, saying you can't make statements like that as a minister. That's reckless and irrational. And now we're in a position where we don't know who's beating the drum. But after last night's announcement, it's clear that the president cannot get rid of these ministers in a real political thing, which is extremely worrying because that does not bode well. Even, let's say, it's purely realpolitik and he's trying us to get around them. If you can't get rid of them, you're not going to get around them. It's not going to work. They're still going to obstruct. From our perspective, it's irrational technically, it's irrational legally, and it just doesn't make sense. It's not going to solve the problem. Power stations take a certain time to build. It's not going to expedite the building of power stations. The bottlenecks aren't something that a state of disaster will fix. At the best, let's say everything goes perfectly, we might win 30 days. But what it opens is, it opens, once again, the idea, the Auditor General was involved in COVID procurement as well. People forget this. It opens the door for massive corruption regarding energy procurement. And if we look at the two polls, which was Budupi and Kusilia's procurement corruption, which is in the billions of rands, along with the COVID procurement corruption, which under the state of disaster managed to just circumvent all processes of oversight, we're looking at it at the potential for massive abuse on that scale. Not to even start talking about irrational and arbitrary regulations that get put in place. Anything that possibly could reduce power would now be able to be charted as a regulation. So if Minister NDZ, who most likely will have to be part of this, decides that no one may activate or may have their geyser on during the daytime, this is a regulation that can now be published. We're not saying they're going to do that, but it's a possibility. A publisher either needs to be off, and the police will then have search and seizure rights to actually go and check if you're complying with this or not. As they did in COVID, is if you tested positive and you were found in a spa, you should have been under quarantine and you weren't doing it, and they would actually have the rights to remove you. So we need to realize, once again, it's very tempting to think this will solve it quicker. It's not going to, and we open this door. The last thing, just to proper explain where our fear comes from and why we're going to court. The state of disaster cannot be lifted until the disaster has passed. Otherwise, why are you in it? So we finally, after 750 days, basically forced them to lift the state of disaster by heading to court and saying the disaster does not exist anymore. If we're starting this, at the minimum, we'll be getting out of load shedding. Let's say everything works perfectly 3 years from now, 2-3 years, if the massive build happens. But if there is any energy constraint or supply constraint, there would then still be reason to be in the state of disaster from the ANC's perspective. Why would they have to lift it if we're looking at even stage 2 load shedding is the energy capacity? It's worded like that, is the energy constraints are still there and they need to get that. So we're looking at potentially, once again, a 700-day, 800-day state of disaster, 2 years. We were in this legislative form with very little oversight, with Sunday evenings where you find out what happens during the week. This creates uncertainty. It does not bode well for a democratic government being that authoritarian regarding this. And the part that galls us especially is this isn't an actual unplanned disaster. We've got a whole ministry who should be handling this. And the fact that they're not doing their job does not warrant a state of disaster. Incompetence is not a disaster. It's something that can be get rid of. Ideally would have been to say, we're getting rid of energy from Minister Montage, and we're getting someone out of the private sector or out of the business sector or the community sector, not necessarily an ANC cadre who will now be in charge of energy, and getting that person, giving him rights to try and get the ship turned around. Our frustration has been Mr. Matash can solve this by gazetting emergency power procurement tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow. Hasn't done it.
Just practically speaking, is it an urgent interdict? Are you going to court in the next few days?
Okay, so we've consulted with our legal team last night. They unfortunately have to sleep. We told them it's not the time for sleep, but no, we will be going to court within days. We're talking about saying this cannot continue. This is not something that we can allow to even get a foothold at any point. We announced luckily we had a head start, because the first time you mentioned it, we already told the president, if you do this, it will be irrational. There are other legislative instruments. It doesn't make any sense. We once again warned him yesterday before the sun, don't do it. You will force us. And now we're in a situation where we're in during COVID repeatedly, where civil society once again has to go to court to force government to actually govern in the correct way, to do the right thing. Luckily, we've got experience with this, so I don't think we're that phased or intimidated at all. It's just a pity that we're here with the president who spoke the whole evening long of social compacting, and then proceeded to announce the very opposite of that, saying we're going to put full power in the executive and once again dictate what you can do.
And just finally, my suspicious mind, would this enable the postponement of the 2024 election, a state of disaster?
I don't know if it will be able to actually postpone the election. We had to, they might get at some point a 2 or 3 month rebate, but we had to have elections during COVID as well. That would be a constitutional imperative that gets transgressed. I don't think they will be able to do it. I'm not that worried about that possibility, that they're going to postpone the election. My bigger worry would be we're going to once again start regulating this sector, when what we should be doing is government should be getting out of the way, saying, please just get on the grid, get on the grid as quick. We're going to make it as quick as possible and as efficient as possible to get you connected. We're going to incentivize you to get connected to start selling electricity. And the role that government does have to play in this is start investing in the transmission grid heavily and enable the private sector to participate in a commodity market, which is essentially what electricity is in most other countries. South Africa still has this monopoly model, but it's massively outdated in world terms, and it's not necessary anymore.
Thank you for the insights. Connie Mulder is the head of Solidarity's Research Institute, and I'm Alec Hogg from BizNews.com.